Minutes to 1 on the morning of Wednesday the 14th of June, the London Fire Brigade received a 999 call. It reported a fire had broken out in a block of flats in Latimer Road, West London.
In the aftermath of the Grenfell Tower disaster, thousands of people living in blocks across the UK were told their flats were clad in similar materials to that which was thought to have contributed to the deadly fire.
The Chancellor's shock revelation that the cladding around the building may have been banned.
The government banned these materials on new high-rise homes and pledged support to carry out emergency remediation work on buildings affected. Yet, more than 4 years later, many blocks have still not had the cladding removed. Sky News has spoken to around 500 leaseholders across the country who talk about the extreme mental health impact and the financial toll of having to live in potentially unsafe buildings.
I don't even own this building. I own the apartment that sits inside this building, and the idea that, my whole financial future could be ruined because of that just seems, I still can't really believe that it could happen.
Our research has exposed the devastating consequences the national building safety crisis is having on flat owners who can't afford to fix the problems with their homes.
We're having to research what will happen to us if we go bankrupt.
The new Housing Secretary, Michael Gove, has said residents should not have to pay to make their homes safe.
But I just don't think as a starting point that we should be asking people who, through no fault of their own, have been landed with these bills to pay the bills on the scale that's been envisaged.
But as the battle over who should pay continues, some leaseholders are suffering depression, chronic anxiety, severe stress and suicidal thoughts, with many at breaking point.
It's completely put my life on hold, really. I also had to see my GP and been diagnosed with anxiety and depression this year, so it's been a real struggle.
4 years on from Grenfell, are high-rise buildings any safer? What toll is the crisis having on residents impacted by the cladding scandal? And who should pay to remove dangerous building materials? Hello and welcome to the Sky News Daily Podcast with me, Dermont, Murnaghan, as we examine the story beyond the headline. Now, Charlotte Lomas, you've been reporting on the Grenfell Tower disaster and the fallout for Sky News since 2017.
Yeah, we can hardly believe it's been 4.5 years since the Grenfell Tower fire, and here we are still talking about cladding, and not just cladding, Dermot. This goes well beyond cladding now. This is a building safety crisis which has been uncovered by Grenfell Tower fire in 2017. That was a story that I covered, and I went on to report on the story for a year after the fire. So I was really keen to investigate further just how much has changed in the last 4.5 years, and also look at the situation when it comes to unsafe housing. We know that there are buildings up and down the country that are still covered in the same cladding that was on Grenfell Tower, and at the moment it seems that there is a substantial lack of data when it comes to just how many buildings there are. So that does beg the question, if you don't know how big this problem is, how do you begin to try and solve it? And so that's really why I wanted to look into this building safety crisis and just learn what the situation is for hundreds of thousands of people, because obviously we think about cladding and we think about buildings, but at the heart of this are human beings who are living inside those buildings. Exactly. So it's been really interesting to actually get to know them and the problem that they face.
So if the government says leaseholders don't have to pay, who will?
Since 2017, there's been a quick succession of housing secretaries, with Michael Gove being the latest in line. And the government have said that they don't want leaseholders to pay.
The easy people to sting are the leaseholders, I think, is wrong. Now, it may well be that I have to come back to this committee or back to the House of Commons and say, look, I've tried my very, very best and I've failed. But I just don't think as a starting point that we should be asking people who, through no fault of their own, have been landed with these bills to pay the bills on the scale that's been envisaged.
We have had conflicting advice along the way over the past years, but the government have created this £5.1 billion fund to try and help remediation of these buildings. That's buildings that are over 18 metres, and that money is to put aside to help fix the dangerous cladding and get that removed. But the estimate to actually get all the cladding off those buildings is 15 billion. So it does fall a lot short of what is needed. And it doesn't take into any consideration of buildings under 18 metres or any other problems apart from cladding. And we know now through all of this investigation over the last 4 years that many of these buildings also have other safety defects, including smoke ventilation, including poor insulation, missing fire breaks or cavity barriers. There's a long list of problems that some of these buildings are facing. And at the moment, it's up to the leaseholder to pay for that. They are liable in law, and that is what many leaseholders are challenging. So we're yet really to hear from the government of their alternative plan. They're saying that leaseholders shouldn't pay and that the polluter should pay, but we're waiting to see what they want to put forward instead.
We contacted the government for a response to this piece, but they declined to give a statement. However, it's worth saying here that ministers recently announced a 4% developer levy. This means developers who build blocks with dangerous cladding will have to pay 4% of their profits from those blocks towards the removal of the cladding. But that only applies to profits greater than £25 million, and the money raised will form part of the £5 billion that the government has already promised. This all means that leaseholders are still collectively left with a bill of around £10 billion. On top of this, residents are facing increased insurance premiums, additional costs for short-term safety precautions, and perhaps worst of all, are left with properties that they're unable to sell. Because who would want to buy a home that could be a potential death trap? Well, Charlotte spoke to a building safety expert, Matt Hodges-Long, about the impact this is having on the wider housing market.
This could undermine the whole housing market. You know, this is typically most of the residents within flats are living in cities or large towns. Quite often they're first-time buyers, or they might be at the other end of the age range where they've moved down for retirement to release some equity. So ultimately, the whole market is now stuck because these flats can't sell, and effectively a stagnation of the property market. So this will affect everybody. This will make chains collapse. If it's not doing already, it will. And so I think everybody will be impacted in some way by this crisis.
Coming up, the personal cost of the cladding scandal, and where will the next phase of the Grenfell Tower inquiry leave people stuck in these properties? Charlotte, as part of your investigation, you've been speaking to people across the country who own flats in blocks with cladding, haven't you? So how much money were they telling you they were looking at in having to pay personally to make their homes safe?
They're six-figure sums, some of these, Dermot. I mean, I've been across the country to talk to some of these leaseholders, many of whom I have to say are at breaking point. There are reports of leaseholders now feeling suicidal. There's lots of people that I've been talking to who are desperate. They are facing immediate bankruptcy and actually face the prospect of having their whole financial future ruined because of this, which they say is totally out of their control. They've done the necessary checks when they bought their flat, and then they later find out there is something wrong with that building that they're liable to fix. A month after Grenfell, Sophie Bishner got the keys to her first property, a flat in a high-rise tower in the heart of Stevenage. But her dream home soon turned into a nightmare.
We have potentially flammable insulation, missing fire breaks, non-ACM cladding that needs to be replaced.
And the cost to fix this is £15 million. Split between each leaseholder means Sophie's bill is £208,000.
For me, thinking about moving on, like starting a family, getting married, even changing jobs, you think like you've got this huge cost on top of you, and I found it really hard, like, relying on my family to help and my partner, because if I go bankrupt, what happens to them? What's the implications to my family and to my partner? And yeah, it's completely put my life on hold, really. I also had to see my GP and been diagnosed with anxiety and depression this year, so it's been a real struggle.
And Sophie wasn't the only person in this position.
So I went to go meet with Rachel Loftus, a 44-year-old woman from Leeds. Now, she actually was awarded an MBE from the Queen for her work during COVID to try and help shield the most vulnerable there. Yet now she's facing a bill of more than £100,000 to remediate her building. And not only that, in the interim, while she's waiting for this bill, she's also having to face insurance premiums that have jumped. They were £300 a year 2 years ago, and now they've jumped to £1,800. Also, she's had to pay £12,000 for what's described as a waking watch, this fire patrol, which walks around your building just to make sure that no fire breaks out. So all the while, Rachel's had to pay these costs and also pay her mortgage, while actually her flat is worthless at the moment. She can't sell it.
I don't even own this building. I own the apartment that sits inside this building, and the idea that I could, my whole financial future could be ruined because of that just seems, it's still astounding and astonishing. I still can't really believe that it could happen, but it's happening. I'm seeing this happen with neighbours, with people, living just across the dock.
So she has costs coming at her front, right and centre, really, and she's just trying to work out if she'll ever be able to pay this bill. And there's also the point that she said to me she might be able to find £10,000 from one friend, £10,000 from another friend, but what's the likelihood of another person in her building being able to do the same? And if everybody can't find that money, then she has to pay more, or essentially she is facing bankruptcy. And it's a really, I would say, really difficult to go and interview these people when they're talking to you and they are really, as I said, at a breaking point.
If I had to choose bankruptcy, I just think, I've worked my whole life. I work hard. I'm really proud of the work I do, and the idea that would have to stop for something that's, not in my control, that breaks me a bit, actually. Sorry.
Well, let's talk about breaking point, because Charlotte, we can only imagine, can't we, the amount of stress that these, as you say, tens, hundreds of thousands of people are under, because you've got those financial worries. But then also, what you mentioned there, it occurred to me that, what is it, the waking watch? If I was living in one of these high-rise flats with this cladding on, you must be scared to go to sleep at night. You don't know what might happen.
Many people are scared. They're very anxious. There's a high level of anxiety and depression among many of the leaseholders that I've spoken to. There are families I know that are really frightened when they put their children to bed at night, and they're having to deal, as you said, with that worry about fire and also their future in terms of when it comes to finance. And another point on all this is that their lives have been put on hold. They're plans that they cannot make. There are a family of 5 that I went to interview in Essex who have a one-bed flat, and they are stuck there, unable to sell their flat. They did have their forever home lined up, ready to move in, and that fell through because of these safety failures within their building. And now they're waiting for a bill. They're a young couple. They have no idea how this is going to impact them. And every day they are just waiting either for a bill or for the government to make an announcement.
They're trying to put the genie back in the bottle after they release it. It's just not possible to do. They've highlighted just how unsafe all these buildings are. The buildings are failing these inspections left, right and centre, and the government have probably realised actually this is a bigger problem than we've initially thought it was, and actually don't need the form. And it's a bit too late. A lot of lenders actually know now that insurance companies, up in insurance premium, they say, no, these buildings are unsafe, and they're not just going to pretend that they're fine.
We're having to research what will happen to us if we go back, if we go bankrupt. That we're having to consider that as a possibility. That's where we're at, and it's, yeah. Sorry.
I think for many leaseholders that I've been in touch with, this is something that's consuming them. It's something that they are really struggling with. It's causing relationships to break down. So this is way more than just claddings on buildings. These are people's lives. There's real growing calls now on the government to take ownership of this crisis and to really try and make building regulations stronger and more prescriptive. And so further issues like this in the future will not happen.
The Grenfell Tower inquiry began in September 2017, a few months after the night of the fire. Phase 1 focused on the events of the night itself, but Phase 2, which started in 2019, is looking at the broader context of the fire, including building regulations and their enforcement. There is some hope, isn't there, Charlotte, that the ongoing Grenfell inquiry could force some changes that could help the people you've spoken to?
I'm not sure if you remember the Lakanal House fire in 2009, and this killed 6 people. And during the inquest, the coroner then made recommendations about external walls and external wall fire and safety. These recommendations were not put into practice. The lessons of this fire were not learned. And so the attention is going to turn towards the government and whether or not there was lessons that were to be learned and recommendations that weren't put in place that could have prevented this from happening.
And the cladding expert, Jonathan Evans, who you spoke to for your piece, believes this evidence could be enough to force the government to take responsibility for the continued use of flammable cladding.
In Module 6, I think it will become very, very obvious that actually the regulations, the guidance, the knowledge of the LFB about the safety of cladding systems after Lakanal and Shepherd's Bush, they knew for at least 5 years that there was a serious problem in the country of external wall fires. So hopefully the people in the Treasury will sit there and think, actually, this is on us. We need to step in. We can't expect the nation and the residents and the innocent people that are sitting facing crippling bills now to actually pay for the mistakes which frankly originated within government.
My thanks to Charlotte Lomas and to you for listening to the Sky News Daily podcast with me, Dermot Murnaghan. If you want more from Charlotte on this issue, you can head to the Sky News website or our YouTube channel to watch her documentary in full. This edition of the podcast was produced by Rosie Gillett. Archive was by Rob Fellows.